What's up, fish tank people? This is Dustin from Dustin's Fish Tanks, and you are tuned in to KGTropicals Tank Talk. Remember to check out DustinsFishTanks.com for all your Planet Aquarium needs. Use the promo code TANKTALK at checkout, and you'll save 20% off your order. Again, head over to DustinsFishTanks.com, use the promo code TANKTALK at checkout, and save yourself 20% off everything on DustinsFishTanks.com. And now, you are listening to Tank Talk with the sensei of cichlids himself, Mr. John Hudson.
Thank you, Dustin. Welcome, folks, to another episode of Tank Talk presented by KGTropicals, Universal Rocks, and, of course, Dustin's Fish Tanks. I am your host, John Hudson, coming at you every week to help you to take your love of fish keeping to the next level. You can contact the show by emailing kgtropicals@gmail.com, or if you want to have some fun, you can call our message line at 1-540-709-1054. I'm very excited to be behind the microphone today because I missed last week's episode of Tank Talk Q&A, so it's been a while since I've actually been behind this microphone. I'm excited. I like talking to y'all. I enjoy it. It's something that I look forward to, and I apologize about missing last week's episode. What are you going to do? I'm not going to make a bunch of excuses. It is what it is. Last week was challenging. Let's just say that. So I got a whole lot of stuff to talk about here today, and I've got a topic that I've wanted to talk about for a long time. It's something that I'm really excited to talk about. I could probably do a 3-hour episode just talking about this, and that is setting up a fish room. Now, a fish room is something that we all either have or want, and there's so much involved in setting up a fish room, and we're going to go into all of that. You know how detailed I like to be, so we're going to go through the whole process of setting up a fish room. It could be a fish room that you're using for some type of business like I do, or it could just be an expansion of the hobby to be able to explore and get involved in new things. So I can't wait to talk about that. But of course, we have some things to talk about here today. Some announcements, and then we're going to get into John's World, which I think is going to be one that's going to be difficult to do, John's World, today, because I'm going to go a little bit personal. I hope you don't mind. But the announcements, first off, I need your help, folks. I need your help with this podcast. Now, the podcast is doing well. I'm really excited by the amount of downloads that we're getting per episode. Very proud of that. It's something that has taken off relatively quickly. And in the podcasting world, the numbers that we're getting for this podcast are encouraging. They very much are. My problem is I kind of gauge everything by the YouTube standards. You know, I'm used to things being a certain way. When I put out a YouTube video, I can expect a certain amount of downloads, or it's actually views with YouTube. It's not downloads, but I can expect there to be a certain amount of views to my videos in that first 24-hour period. And the numbers are not the same for the podcast. This isn't me complaining, folks. I don't expect the same results. I've been working on building my brand on YouTube for 2.5 years, almost 3 years now. And this podcast is only a couple of months old. So I'm not expecting it to perform the same way. But when you're used to seeing numbers through YouTube, and then you get into this new venture and the numbers aren't the same, it's kind of like, oh man, what am I doing wrong? And I think that the biggest thing is that I need your help with it. Now, this is not me asking you to go and start a campaign of advertising my podcast. Not like that at all, folks. What I'm going to do is ask you to do me a little bit of a favor and just become active with this podcast. What I mean is comment on the podcast. Go on our Libsyn page, which is, I'll put the link to it down in the description. If you're listening to this on Stitcher or iTunes or, Podcast Republic or any of those podcast directories, then, you don't have access to this page. But, whatever podcasting directory you're on or whatever, if you wouldn't mind just doing me the quick favor of going to the comments section, making a comment, even if it's something, hey, John's got a funny looking bald head, whatever it is that you put up there, it helps us, because these podcast directories are really no different than YouTube. The interaction with you, the listener, is what gets you higher on the list of suggested podcasts for people to listen to. Now, with YouTube, it's all about keeping people on your channel and keeping people interested in your videos, commenting, liking. These are all things that help the Google algorithm. I always mess that word up. To get you higher up on the results. Now, podcasting is different because it's not just one place. You've got podcasts all over, or different directories all over. And so it's kind of a cumulative effect for each one of those directories. So all I'm asking, folks, is for you to do a little something. If you're enjoying this podcast, if this is something that you look forward to, which I get a lot of people emailing me saying how much they appreciate it. Thank you for that. If you do appreciate it, and this is something that you look forward to every week, just do me that favor of going on to one of whatever directory you're using and putting up a comment for us, or a rating, or you can do a review if you're on iTunes or Stitcher, whatever it is. That would really help, because something that we talked about a few weeks ago, I talked about how proud I was that the podcast had made it to the new and noteworthy list on iTunes. That was huge for me, folks. We actually made it all the way to the top row of the new and noteworthy list. And we were number 1 on the new and noteworthy list for a little bit of time, under the games and hobbies category. That was so exciting, but unfortunately, you're only able to be on the new and noteworthy list for a short period of time. You're only new for so long. So unfortunately, we were taken off of that list. It's not due to performance. It's more due to the fact that we had been on there long enough, and there were more new and noteworthy podcasts that needed to make that list. So we're not on there anymore. We are, however, on the What's Hot list on YouTube. Again, this is a big achievement because there's so many podcasts out there. I'm so proud of being where I am on the list on iTunes. iTunes is the most, it is the Google of podcasting. It's the biggest out there. If you make it on iTunes, then you are going to be a successful podcast. But here's the interesting thing, and I don't understand why this is the case. iTunes is a very small part of the listenership to this podcast. I don't know why that is. Libsyn, which is the media host that I use, they provide very detailed statistics and analytics for the podcast. And they actually tell you where these people are coming from that are listening to your podcast. Now, a lot of you are listening by way of my website, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the people that are listening directly from iTunes, there's not very many. And most podcasts out there, the vast majority of their listenership comes from iTunes. So I don't really know where I went wrong there, but if you could just help me out and do a little review or give me a star rating, or, whatever it is that your directory offers to you, that would be a huge help. If you like what we're doing, if you could do me that favor, that would be awesome. I'd appreciate it very much. You know what time it is. It is time to talk about Dustin's Fish Tanks. I am recording this live here, folks. I am not someone who does pre-recorded commercials for my sponsors or anything like that. I don't like that. I want you to hear my words when it comes to talking about these sponsors. And the only sponsors that I will ever allow to touch this show and dilute my product is sponsors that I believe in and that I feel wholeheartedly represent this hobby well. And 2 of those companies are Universal Rocks and Dustin's Fish Tanks, folks. You know me. You know my relationship with Dustin. You know my relationship with Universal Rocks. These are people that I've known for a long time. I've done things with. And all I'm going to tell you on this episode, folks, is that I believe wholeheartedly in both of these products. Both of these companies are run by good people. They provide the finest products on the market out there today. You can go on their websites, universalrocks.com, dustinsfishtanks.com. You can order everything for the interior of your tank. You can get your nice decorative rocks, your 3D background, and order all of the plants to go in front of it from both of those websites. And if you enter Tank Talk at checkout, they're going to give you some huge discounts. Universal Rocks, 15% is what they're going to take off of your order if you enter Tank Talk at checkout. And Dustin, my man Dustin is going to give you 20% off if you put Tank Talk in the promo box at checkout. Folks, this is the deal of a lifetime. Please help to support our sponsors, support us, support everybody. Let's all live happily ever after. Head over to those two websites and order up these products. You're going to get them anyway, so you might as well save some money. You're trying to save up the money to buy this stuff? Well, if you consider the discounts, you might have the money already. So go on there, check those out, and order up some of these products. Help us out, help them out. Everybody wins. Thank you so much. And let's move on and let's talk about building a fish room. This is going to be fun. The fish room. It's something that we have all thought about doing or we have already done. If you're in this hobby for any length of time, you know what happens in this hobby. You start out with a small tank just to get your feet wet, no pun intended. And then as you build with this hobby, as you grow in this hobby, you realize that there's other fish or maybe other plants or whatever. There's things that you want to expand into. You can't do that because these fish don't mix with those fish and you can't have live plants with those. And you just end up going and getting another tank. And then what ends up happening, your hobby continues to grow. You continue to get interested in new things. And of course you need another tank. And this continues on to the point where you have multiple tanks all over the house, and you may decide that it's time to set up a room dedicated specifically to your hobby. Now, this is nothing new, folks. We all have our hobby rooms. People have craft rooms. People have exercise rooms. Mine's going to be at the shop. People have rooms that they completely commit the entire room to building model airplanes. There's just, everybody has it. Woodworking shops, whatever it is. We all have our area that we participate in our hobby in. And for fish keepers, we build fish rooms. Now, some of us don't. Some of us just have our tanks spread out all over the house, and that's fine. You decorate your whole house with aquariums. Ain't nothing wrong with that. But for efficiency, as far as your maintenance goes, you're not dragging hoses or buckets all over the house. And for one central location to where you can enjoy this hobby all in one place, most of us eventually will evolve into having our own fish room. Now, some of you may do what Lisa and I did. We had tanks all over, from our bedroom to our kids' rooms to the living room. We had them all over the place, and we decided that we were going to start a business. And we're not going to have fish all over the house with, running a business. So we decided to dedicate a room in our house to being a fish room. And we had a 9-foot by 11-foot den in our basement that we filled up with 42 aquariums. That was our fish room that we had for about a year, I guess, until we moved out into our garage. And of course, we have since moved into the shop and we've moved into a new house and all of this. It went crazy from there, but our first fish room was in our den in our house. Before we moved into that house, there was a small room that was intended to be a bedroom, but it never had any carpet or anything in it. In the basement of the house we were in prior to the house that we started KGTropicals in, that, I don't remember the dimensions of that room, but it was a very small room, and we were planning on making that house or that room into a fish room. But unfortunately, a huge storm, came through and flooded that basement with like 6 inches of water. The whole basement got all moldy, and a couple of the kids are allergic to mold. It got to be a huge problem. And so we had to move out of there. And of course, we didn't end up making the fish room in that house. We didn't do it until we got into the new house, and it was a small room that we put 42 tanks into, and we had a lot of fun with that. So if you're going to, or if you're on the fence of whether or not to start a fish room, the first thing to think about is, what would you use it for? Do you want a central location where you can enjoy this hobby and have all of your tanks in one place? What I've seen so many people do. In fact, my friend, Dickie Lewis is, his nickname is Dickie. He's got a fish room in his basement. He's got tanks all the way around the perimeter of the room. And then he has one recliner. And that one recliner is a swivel rocker that he can sit in his recliner and he can spin around and look at all of his tanks. And that's really, really cool. I'm going to actually, one of these days, I'm going to get over to his house and I'm going to do a video of his basement, because it's like the ultimate man cave. But that's what a lot of people do, is one room where you have all of your aquariums, and everything about this hobby is all in one room. Again, some people will do it for a business, but either way, there's a lot of things to think about as far as the room itself before you start to put aquariums in it. And that's what we're going to talk about first. First things first, the type of room that you're going to be putting these in. Now, if it's a room that is a central room in the house, on the second floor, maybe it's a spare bedroom or a guest room or something like that, is the floor properly supported? You're going to be talking about, like 8.3 pounds per gallon. And if you're talking about putting multiple tanks into that one room, you do need to consider the floor and how the floor will support all of the weight that you're going to be putting into that room. You need to think about that first. Most people, when they build a fish room, they do it in their basement, and that makes sense because you're putting your aquariums right there on the concrete floor, and I don't care how many tanks you put down there, you're not going to bust a concrete floor. So think about the floor, and also think about utilities before you start your fish room. What I mean by that is heat. How are you going to heat that room? We're going to talk a little bit later about heating the room or heating each individual tank. If you're going to heat the room, which is what we've always done, you do need to look into that and look into how you're going to heat the room. Are you going to use little space heaters, or are you going to add some type of heater to this room? How are you going to heat the room? How big is the room? How big of a heater are you going to need? These are things that you need to think about. Another thing is your water supply. I know it might seem common sense, but so many people that I've spoken to have set up a fish room and they never even considered water. I know it sounds weird, but so many people do that. And all of a sudden now they have these, 27 tanks in one room and they have no way to get water into the room. So you definitely want to think about a water supply. Of course, every person's dream would be to actually run a water supply pipe to that room that's used exclusively for the fish room. That would be ideal, but some of us can't do that. And you got to work with what you got. So are you at least close to a sink? Are you close to a drop sink, a utility sink, whatever you want to call it? Or is your situation kind of like mine in my basement that I'm sitting in as we speak, where I don't have a water supply in the room, but what I do have is a hose bib right outside the door. So I just hook a hose to the hose bib and there's my water for my tanks and it works out perfectly fine. So I don't have a water supply in the room here, but I have one close by that I can get to very, very easily. The next thing is a drain. Again, if you're dealing with multiple tanks, if you're going to put 25 tanks in one room, you're not going to want to do water changes using buckets. You're going to want to either be using a hose that you can drain out your door or through a window or something like that, or even a drain that's in the floor. You're going to want somewhere to drain the water as you're doing water changes, because the ideal thing to have is either a Python system or an Aqueon system, something that hooks up to your sink and drains the water from your tank directly into your sink. Or you want to have what I have. I have this in my shop and I have this in my basement here at the house. I have a drain in the floor. I didn't put the drains there. They were there when we moved in, but there's a drain in the floor of the house and there's multiple drains in the floor of the shop. And so what I have is a long siphon tube, and I will siphon, I'll get it primed up and I'll get it going and I'll stick it in that drain, and then I can just go from tank to tank to tank to tank doing my water changes. And the cool thing about doing it that way is I have my hose coming in from outside and I have my hose that goes into my drain. So I can actually siphon water while filling up another tank at the same time. Now, if you know anything about me, my YouTube videos, my basement, you're thinking, but John, you only have one tank in your basement. So why would you need to do that? Well, guess what? I got a super secret project going on in my basement right now that I'm not going to tell you about, but there are more tanks in my studio now. It's a work in progress. You will know sooner or later, or sooner than later. Trust me. Really excited about it. And so, yes, there are more tanks in my studio now than just my Peacock tank that you have seen, in all of my videos. And so it is, nice to be able to fill one tank up while I'm draining the other. And I don't have to worry about carrying buckets. I don't even have a bucket at my house right now because I just don't need it. So a water supply and a drain are two things that you really do want to think about before you commit a room to being a fish room. Now, the drain can be, like I said before, you can have something as simple as a Python system. They're available on my website. Anything that you have, if you're going to have a fish room, I would definitely recommend to you that you have some way to drain the water away from the room, not into buckets. Now, if that's impossible, I for whatever reason, there's no way to get water supplied to that room, what I would suggest, it'll cost you maybe, I don't know, $60 or $70. You go to Home Depot or Lowe's. I prefer Home Depot because I don't like Jimmy Johnson. If you don't know what I mean by that, just figure it out. I'm from King George. I'm from the country. We like NASCAR. Jimmy Johnson drives the Lowe's car. You see what I'm saying? I don't dislike the guy. He's a good guy, but he wins all the time, and that's why I don't like him. So I like Home Depot because it's a Joe Gibbs car. So, I prefer Home Depot, but you go to either one of those places and you buy one of those large 35-gallon Rubbermaid trash cans. And while you're there, you buy one of those wheels. It's like a whole assembly that attaches to the bottom of the trash can so that you can wheel the trash can around. Use that to drain your tanks in. That's what we do at the shop when we're not draining the water straight down into those drains. Lisa uses the trash can. She doesn't like using the drain in the floor. I don't know why that is. She's just hard-headed, I guess, but she prefers to use the trash can. So what we do is we drain the tanks into that trash can, and then we wheel the trash can over to the door, and we have a little pump in there. It's a little, like pond pump that would be used for like waterfalls and stuff like that. And we pump the water out of the trash can out into the parking lot of the shop. That's the way we do it there. It is what it is. Lisa, that's just the way she likes to do it. But if that's the only way that you can do it, I would definitely recommend that rather than carrying 5-gallon buckets. If you're old and out of shape like I am, carrying those buckets can be quite the chore, especially if you're going up and down stairs. So, water supply, water drain, two critical things that you need to think about before you commit the room. The other is, how are you going to handle the electrical load, and how are you going to handle the humidity? I don't care what anybody says. Aquariums, especially in large groups, cause quite a bit of humidity in your room. So you do need to think about that. Are you going to be in a situation where your walls are going to start to accumulate mold and all of that kind of stuff? It will happen, folks, and you need to be prepared for that. So how are you going to handle humidity? It could be things as simple as cracking a window, having a fan in there circulating the air. You could buy a dehumidifier. They don't cost a fortune. You will be emptying it out quite a bit if you have that in a fish room. But humidity is something that you're definitely going to want to control, because if you don't, the room is going to become a stuffy, musty, yucky room to go into because of all of the humidity, especially when your tanks all get good and settled in and they start to have that aquarium smell. It's going to be pretty funky in that room. So you're going to want to control that. Something as simple as cracking a window and putting on a ceiling fan will certainly help that. But humidity is something to consider, and electricity. The aquariums, they take a lot of electricity, folks, especially if you're going to individually filter every single one of these tanks. You're going to have an individual filter. You're going to have individual heaters. You're going to have air pumps, lights. All of these things consume quite a bit of electricity. So is the room that you're planning on using equipped with enough power to support a fish room? If it's not, make sure you address that prior to bringing in all of your tanks, because if you don't, your electrician that you hire is going to charge you twice as much because he's going to have to juggle or climb around and work around all of these tanks. It's not going to make him happy, and he's definitely going to charge you for that. So before you even bring a fish into the room that you're planning on committing to being your fish room, consider heat. We're going to get into more depth about heat in a little bit. Consider humidity, consider your water supply and your water drain, and consider electricity. These are the things that you need to think about before you even bring a single aquarium into the room. And once you have all of those things addressed, now we can start to put our plan together for our fish room. So let's act as if we are starting from scratch. You got a wide open room. It is ready to go, and we are going to make this room into a fish room. Now, I want to stipulate here for a second, folks. I'm going to use just kind of a generic room here, okay? I'm going to use a room that has plenty of power. It's got plenty of heat. It's in the basement, so it's sitting on a concrete slab. That is what we're going to work with when we design our fish room here on this podcast. So your situation may be a little bit different. You may need to modify your plan a little bit, but that's what we're going to be talking about as we move forward with this. So let's start from scratch and let's build us a fish room. Okay, so just like any project, a good plan will make or break your project. So the first thing that I want you to do when you have decided that you have a room, this is the room that you're going to use as your fish room, I want you to take a small chair or even a 5-gallon bucket, turn it upside down, find something to sit on. I want you to go into that room and I want you to just sit there for a little bit. I want you to sit there and I want you to think about what you're going to set up in this room. I want you to vision what's going to happen in this room. Okay. And while you're doing that, I want you to ask a couple of questions to yourself. What is this room for? That's the first thing. I know the obvious answer is, well, it's a fish room. I'm going to put all my fish in here. But what I mean is, are you going to be breeding? Are you going to be using this room just as a way of going in and enjoying this hobby? And so you want all of your tanks to be show tanks. Or are you going to be starting a business like KGTropicals did? All of these things, all of these decisions are going to impact the design of this room. What I mean by that is if you're breeding and your plan is to breed in big numbers and sell as many fish as you can because you either want to be completely broke like me or you want to just be able to support the hobby by selling the fish that you're breeding, well, you're going to want to breed these fish in large numbers. And so you're going to take the approach of design a little bit differently than if this was just going to be a showroom. You're going to want to have as many tanks crammed into that room as possible because you're going to want to have as many fish as possible. So you're going to probably design the room completely differently. If you're doing it as a business or a little side business or whatever it is, you're going to design it differently if you're doing it for that purpose than if you're doing it just for show. Here's what I mean. When you're sitting down in the room and you're looking around and you're saying, okay, I'm going to put a rack there, I'm going to put a rack there and one there, and then maybe I'll run a rack through the center of the room here. Well, if you're breeding and you're wanting as many fry tanks and grow out tanks as possible, one of the first things that you're going to consider is putting your tanks on the racks sideways so that when you look at the rack, you're looking at the end or the side of your tanks. If you refer to any of my latest shipment videos that I've done where I've shown you the new rack of tanks that we put up, that's what I'm talking about. You look at all of those 20-gallon longs and you see that they're all put in there with their show sides butting up against each other so that all you see is the side of the tank, which gives you very little visibility into each tank. This is okay if you're just raising fry or if you just have breeders in there. But if you're wanting this for show, it's not going to show very well. So doing it this way, putting the tanks sideways is a big factor, in the decision of how you're going to design this room, because if they're sideways, it's not going to look as good, but you're going to be able to fit twice as many tanks in there as you would if you put them all for the show side facing out. So that's one of the biggest things. What are you going to use this room for? Because that's going to play a role in how you're going to design it. So let's just, I mean, the way I'm going to talk about this moving forward is it's going to address either way. It's not really going to matter, as far as the design goes. It's not going to matter either way. We'll address both of them as we continue on here. So the first decision that you're going to need to make, obviously, is what are you going to use the room for? Secondly, is the layout of the room. You'd be surprised how many tanks you can fit in a small room. Like I said before, I had a 9-foot by 11-foot room. We had 42 tanks in that room. I mean, that's a lot of tanks in a small room like that. So you have to be creative in how you lay them out. And some of the tanks are turned sideways. Some of them are with the show side facing. The way we've always done it, and again, we were setting this up for breeding. We always had our breeder tanks with the show side facing us, which would mean the long side of the aquarium is facing out so that we can see everything that's going on in those tanks. But our grow out tanks and our fry tanks were always turned sideways so that we could fit twice as many of them. And what we ended up doing, which looked really nice, I don't have any videos of this, but we would have a row of breeder tanks where the show side is facing out. And then above that, we would have 10-gallon tanks turned sideways all the way across. And those would be the fry that came from that breeder tank that's right below them. Am I making any sense here? I know this is hard to describe this through audio, but that's what we would do. That's one of the things that we would do to not only be able to enjoy it as a fish room, but also have as many tanks as possible because we wanted to breed them and we wanted to breed them in big numbers. So how is the room going to lay out? Where are the racks going to go? How are you going to want the tanks to be shown? Do you want to see them from the side? Do you want to see them from the show side? This is going to be one of the biggest decisions. How many tanks you're going to stack? Are you going to have them too high, meaning you have a tank on the bottom row and a tank on the top right above it? Or are you only going to be able to go one high because your ceilings are only 6 feet high? Or I don't know, maybe you're in a little cellar or something. You know, how you're going to lay out these racks. One of the things that I would recommend to you, I know this sounds crazy, is design the room to fit even tanks that you don't have yet. Even if you're saying, you know what, I'm going to put 20 tanks in this room and that's it. You're lying to yourself because you know how this hobby goes. You know what's going to happen. You're going to put those 20 tanks in there and you're going to have all this extra space. And then 6 months down the road, you're going to go, man, this is not working. I'm going to have to redo the whole thing because I need to get 20 more tanks in here. So be aware of that. Design the room to accommodate as many tanks as possible. You're not rich, neither am I, but you are going to grow with this hobby and you're going to eventually want to add more. So make sure you design it to hold as many as possible. So we're sitting in this room now. We have this plan of where we're going to put our racks. Maybe you're going to put them around the perimeter of the room, and then you're going to have a row going right through the center of the room. And that's something that works. It works really well because you get a lot of tanks going right through there. What I've seen a lot of people do is they'll have all of their breeder tanks, and this is even breeding just as a hobby. They'll have their breeder tanks around the perimeter of the room with the show side facing out. And then in the center of the room, they'll have a row of tanks that are stacked like 3 high, and they're all turned sideways, and those are all for the fry. However it's going to be designed is completely up to you, but just think about the flow of the room, thinking about how is it going to be when I'm dragging a hose through here to do my maintenance? How's it going to be when I'm feeding the fish? Because you're going to be feeding these fish in big numbers. How is it going to be walking around? Am I going to be stumbling over wires and cords and hoses? Think of this as you're making your design. And then you have your design set up for your racks. And now it's time to start thinking about some of the mechanical things that have to do with the fish room, like filtration, heat, lighting, all of that kind of stuff. Now, filtration and heat are two things that kind of work together. The decision that you make for one is going to impact the other. And here's what I'm talking about. When it comes to filtration, you're really only going to have a few options. You're going to have the option of putting hang on the back mechanical, and when I say mechanical, meaning motorized hang on the back filters to individually filter each tank in your shop. Very efficient to do it that way, very expensive, but it's a very efficient way to do it. You have that option. Your second option would be to filter the tanks with air, meaning you're using sponge filters. Your third option would be using a recirculating system. Now, this is not going to be a podcast all about setting up a recirculating system. As many times as people have asked that I do that, it's impossible to do that on a podcast and explain how to set up a recirculating system. Maybe that's something that we can do in a video someday, but a recirculating system is basically you've got all of the tanks hooked together. All of the water from all of the tanks, instead of flowing into a filter that's on the back of each individual filter, the water flows down to a centralized filtration unit or a sump, and it's filtered there and then taken by way of pumps back up to the tanks. And so all of the tanks are hooked up to one centralized filter. Now, there's pros and cons to every single one of these options. The hang on the back filters, I'm sorry, I lost track there for a second. Hang on the back filters are a very efficient way of doing it, but they're also a very expensive way of doing it because you're going to have all of these filter cartridges that you have to change out in each individual tank. You got 40 tanks in a room, that can get pretty expensive. That's a lot of maintenance. That's a lot of money buying these filter cartridges. So you have to consider that. And you also have to consider if you have 40 tanks in a room, that's 40 impellers that at any moment can go bad. That's 40 filters that could be clogged up and not running properly, or the impeller died on it. There's only a few different things that can go wrong with these filters, but you've got 40 individual little mechanical units that can break down at any moment. And so you have to consider that. If you're going to choose to do a individually filtered room and you have that many tanks, if you got 4 or 5 tanks in the room, it's no big deal. Use hang on the back filters, no problem. But we're talking about setting up a massive fish room here where you've got dozens and dozens of tanks. There are more cost-effective ways of filtering your system. I'm not going to tell you that they're more efficient though, because I think all 3 of these options are very efficient ways of filtering the tanks. So hang on the back filters, expensive, very efficient, very loud. You may not think it, but they will be loud once you get 40 of them in a room. But they're very time consuming to take care of them. Now, sponge filters are great because they're very cheap. You don't have to replace any kind of filter cartridges or anything like that. They're a great source for the growth of beneficial bacteria. They are way more efficient than you think they are, and they work extremely well. Cheap, easy to maintain, no maintenance required whatsoever, except when you're doing water changes, squeeze them out every once in a while. Brilliant. This is what so many people use in big shops where they've got hundreds and hundreds of tanks, like mine. It's very efficient and very cheap and very easy to do. And your sponge filters are driven by a centralized air pump. This does not mean that you would have 40 tanks. You've got 40 little air pumps sitting on the back of the tanks. No, you're going to hook up a central system to provide the air to all of the tanks. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Man, 50 minutes already. Good Lord. The third option is the sumps, a recirculating system. Now, this is a system that's much more involved, much more expensive to set up, but it's very, very efficient. It's one of those things where we would all love, anybody who has a house that's on a concrete slab, we would all love to have a radiant floor heating system, not the little baseboard heaters, but the where they run the plumbing pipes through the concrete and then they circulate hot water through those pipes, which radiantly heats the entire room. Very efficient. The warmest room you've ever been in your life. It feels good, but it's extremely expensive to set that up when you're building your house. This is the same thing. A sump system, a recirculating system, will benefit you in the end, because they're so efficient and it works so well, but you got to pay a lot of money up front to get it set up. If that doesn't scare you, then this is probably the most efficient and easiest thing to do, is set up a recirculating system. There are people that would say, yeah, but then you can get disease that'll spread through your system. And if one fish gets sick, it's going to infect all of the fish. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you. Yes, that can happen. But if you're dealing with all your own fish because you're a breeder, then how's that going to be a problem? You're not introducing anything foreign into the tanks. You're not bringing in fish that just got pulled straight out of Lake Malawi. You know, the risk of something like that is pretty slim. And just about all of these farms are on recirculating systems, folks. So, there is risk, sure. But, if you're bringing in fish that are from straight from the lake, or they're wild caught, or they're from a shady farm or something like that, you just quarantine them in a tank by themselves in a tank that is not hooked up to your system. And once they're okay, then you bring them over and you put them into your system. So that's really the only argument against recirculating system, is the potential threat that a disease could spread. But as far as efficiency goes, the recirculating system is absolutely the way to go. And here's one of the biggest reasons why. If you design it properly, again, I can't get into all of this on this podcast, but if you design it properly, you can actually do water changes in all of your tanks in one spot. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, look back in my videos, go on my YouTube channel, KGTropicals, and look about a year ago. It might have been last July. I'm not sure when it was. I went and spent the day with my good friend Hans up in Baltimore. Discus Hans, if you're not familiar with him. One of the most well-known names in the discus industry. Brilliant man. He designed a system in his shop that is absolutely fantastic. And I actually did an entire video with him, where he demonstrated how he does water changes in his fish house. That's what he calls it, is his fish house. It's absolutely brilliant. And that is what I'm talking about. Go watch that video and you'll see that you can actually set up your recirculating system and do your water changes through that. It's brilliant. Makes things very easy. So, but again, like I said, this would definitely be the most expensive way of setting up your filtration system. So those are really the only three options that there are. I mean, somebody might come up with some kind of obscure way of filtering multiple tanks. Good Lord, I am struggling today. But really, those are the only three options. You can individually filter each tank by way of a hang on the back filter or a sponge filter, or you can build a recirculating system. They all work. They all work fine. They all have their pros and cons. If I had to pick one, if it was up to me, and I was setting up a fish room from scratch, now I'd be looking at it from the business angle. I would be building something that would look identical to what you would see if you watched that video that I did with Hans. It is a brilliant system that he has set up in his shop, and that's exactly what I would do if I was setting up a system today. If I was setting it up for all of my tanks to just be show tanks, so I can be like my friend Dickie Lewis and sit in my recliner in the center of the room and just spin around and look at all of my tanks, I would probably filter every single tank with canister filters. Now, this is something that we didn't talk about, but it's really the same thing as hang on the back filters. It's an individual filter that filters only the tank that it's hooked up to. I would probably hook them all up to canister filters. My fantasy is to someday have a studio where, Lisa and I buy a house and we commit a certain area to, being a studio. I would have a very large tank. I mean, I'm talking 400 gallons. And I would have that tank be for arowanas and stingrays. If you don't know anything about my history, arowanas are what got me into fish keeping. And I would have probably a huge sump system for that tank. But my studio would also have like 6 150-gallon tanks. I'd have a discus tank, a community tank, a planted tank, an Mbuna tank, a peacock and half tank, and all of those would be filtered with FX6s from Fluval. That's not me doing an advertisement, although they are available on my website. That is just me telling you that's how much I love that filter. I think it's the best filter on the market, and I would probably put 2 on each tank. Is 2 on each tank overkill? Yeah, but I like it that way. So I would probably have, for those 150-gallon tanks, I would have FX6s, 2 of them on each one, and then a big sump system for my big arowana tank. But that's just me telling you what my fantasy would be. That's how I would do it. But setting it up as a business, I would be doing it exactly like Hans's setup. So definitely go over and watch that. Now, I mentioned heat because you do have some options. With heat, you only have 3 options that are pretty much the same as the filtration. You can either heat the entire room, which to me is similar to a recirculating system for your filtration. You're heating the entire room. It's easy. I mean, if your room is pretty sealed up and, you don't have windows cracked and all of that, you can put one heater in that room, heat the entire room up to 80 degrees, and you're good to go. Not going to be very comfortable if you're going in there, just to enjoy yourself and go look at the fish, but it's a very efficient way of keeping your tanks all to the same temperature, because whatever the room is, that's what your tank is going to be. So if you heat the room up to 80 degrees, all of your tanks are going to be 80 degrees. Now, again, if you're in there working, if you're in there just trying to enjoy yourself and maybe have a glass of wine or something like that, it's not going to be very nice to do that in a room that's 80 degrees. Maybe in the winter, but in the summer, that would just be miserable. So it's a very efficient way of doing it, but it's not the most comfortable way. Another way of doing it, if you choose a recirculating system, then you're going to probably want to put your heaters down in your sumps. Then it's recirculating that heated water throughout the entire system. Very efficient. That's what I've done in my 240. Most people who have sumps will heat their tank. They'll put their heaters in the sump. It just makes sense to do it that way. Why have this big glass tube in your tank when you can put it down in your sump? So, and then the last way would be to put a heater in each individual tank. Now, again, if you got 4 or 5 tanks, that's fine. But if you're setting up a room with dozens of tanks in it, it would probably be the least efficient way of doing this. It'll keep your tanks warm. All of your tanks will be up there to 80 degrees or whatever temperature you want to set it at. But look out when you get your power bill. Good Lord Almighty, that power bill is going to go completely out of control. So you need to be aware of that. Heating all of those heaters is just heating all of those tanks individually is absurd. And you also do have the threat of mechanical failure. One of those heaters goes out. What are you going to do? I mean, I've seen way too many people lose an entire tank of fish because their heater malfunctioned. So the most efficient way is really going to depend. The most efficient way to heat your tanks is going to depend on the filtration that you choose. If you choose to individually filter all of your tanks because you're somebody who's just terrified of the spread of disease and stuff like that, okay, fine. I understand. You're fine there. You need to make the decision of whether you're going to put a heater in each individual tank, which is crazy because it's going to cost you a fortune and the power bill is going to go out of control, or are you going to heat your room? Those are really going to be your only 2 options. But if you're choosing a recirculating system, you have the money, you have the patience, and you're not afraid of the whole disease thing, put your heaters down in your sumps and don't worry about it. That's going to be the best way to do it. So let's talk about air. Let's talk about breathing. Okay, I probably shouldn't have said it that way. We all know that the fish don't breathe the air. They draw oxygen from the water, blah, 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 blah. But breathing air, it just makes sense. So air is another thing that you really, whether you're setting up your system to run on sponge filters or not, you're going to want a central air system in your fish room because you're going to want to have your air stones. You're going to want to use air stones for circulation to help to oxygenate the water. You're going to want air in your fish room. And so the choices there are the same as everything else. Are you going to individually provide air to the tanks, meaning a little air pump on the back of each tank dumb idea, but some people will do that. Or do you want to provide the air by using a centralized system, one large air pump that provides air to all of the tanks? Now, if you're going to do this, you do have some setup, just like anything else. If you're going to use one pump, then you're going to be running plumbing pipes all the way around your room. So this is another thing. This is another decision that you'll want to make up front, because you're going to want to know how you're going to route those plumbing pipes. I don't know if I've ever shown it on any of my videos, because I just don't know. I don't know but there might be some where you maybe have been able to see it in the background or something like that. But I have I'm going to try to say this word without botching it, regenerative blower, that provides the air to all of my tanks in the shop, with the exception of the new rack that I just put up. This blower is what you hear making that sound in the background of all of my videos when I was still doing my videos at the shop. You don't hear it anymore, but when I was at the shop, you heard that horrible whistling sound. That is from the blower. That's the only drawback to these blowers, is that they make a whistling sound. After you're in there for a while, you don't hear it anymore, but it is still there. And but the blowers are very powerful. I mean, they're really, really strong. And I know mine that I have, on my main system in the shop, it can run up to 400 individual air stones. So it's extremely strong. But what I have, which you probably haven't seen, is I have a plumbing pipe. It's a 1-inch PVC plumbing pipe that goes all the way around the entire room. It goes above every single tank. The pipe goes across the top of every single rack. That's probably the best way to say it. And then what you do from there is you have individual little valves that you will drill into the PVC pipe, and then you'll hook your air line up to that. Your 1/4 inch, I think it's 1/4 inch, normal aquarium air tubing. You'll hook directly to those. So again, the setup is much more involved to be able to do something like this. But if you think about it, you have one pump that's providing the air to all of those tanks, all of the tanks in your room. It's much more efficient than to have individual ones that they can all individually break, and you're just constantly going out there and buying new pumps. Now, your question, I'm going to address this right up front, because somebody will ask it. Well, John, what do you do if you're running your system on one air pump or one blower or whatever you're using, and that blower goes out? What do you do then? Well, to me, if you're setting up a fish room and you're setting up your air system, you don't just buy one, you buy two. Is his name Ted Judy? I think is the guy on YouTube, has a really nice YouTube channel. And he did a video, talking about his air system. I'm not 100% sure. I should have been a professional and looked at this before I started talking about it, but I wasn't planning on talking about it. I'm pretty sure his video where he talks about air, he actually has 2 pumps hooked up to his system. He shows you the pumps. One is sitting there unplugged. It's hooked up, but it's unplugged, and the valve on it is turned off. That is there so that if one goes out, he can just immediately turn the other one on and everything's back to normal. If you're going to set up a recirculating air system, and yes, it is recirculating, we're going to talk about that in a second, I would definitely buy 2, especially if you're going to be hooking up 24 tanks, 40 tanks. I would buy 2 of them. Keep that in mind when you're setting up your budget. Because you definitely don't want them all to go out. All your tanks go out, especially if you're filtering your tanks with sponge filters that rely on this pump to provide it with air, and your pump goes out. What are you going to do? You're going to have to run somewhere and buy one of these pumps. And these pumps that I'm talking about, they're not readily available at your pet stores. Every single one that I've ever had, I've either bought from a shop. My blower I bought from a shop that went out of business, and my other pumps that we're going to talk about in a second, I actually ordered those online. So if you're sitting in your fish room and all of a sudden your air goes out, you're like, uh-oh, what do I do now? It's Saturday. I got to go online and I got to order this pump. They're not going to send it out till Monday or Tuesday. I'm not going to have it till the end of the week. All of my fish are going to be dead by then. You don't want that to happen. So if you're going to set up a recirculating system, I definitely recommend that you buy 2 pumps. Going to cost you more, but you'll be glad in case one of those goes out. And they do break. I mean, the blowers to me are the ones that are almost like Toyotas. I mean, they just never break. But the linear piston pumps, which we haven't talked about yet, those do go bad. There's a lot more moving parts in there than there are with blowers. So they do tend to go out, and you have to rebuild them and stuff like that. It's a huge thing. And if this happens in the middle of the night, you're definitely not going to want to be doing that. So if you're going to set it up that way, buy 2 pumps. I just mentioned linear piston air pumps. It's a different deal than the blowers. Your blower is basically a huge fan that's inside of a housing. That fan spins, and that's what causes this air. This is why they're so loud. They're very loud. They're not something that I would want to use in a home fish room. If I was setting up a fish room in my home, I would use a pump just like the one I have on my rack of 60 20-gallon tanks that I just set up. I haven't shown it on video. Maybe I will one day. But the pump that I use is a Pond Master AP100. And it's a linear piston air pump made by the company, I believe, is Danner, that makes it. It's a very efficient, not all that expensive air pump. And as far as the noise that it makes, it's the equivalent of just a regular aquarium air pump that you would put on the back of your tank. It's a gentle hum. It's nothing offensive. It's nothing that would be distracting or really bother you. You could relax in a room with one of these pumps going. It's maybe a little bit louder than a regular air pump that you would put on the back of your tank, but nothing to where it's offensive. Believe me. If I was setting up a fish room in my house right now, that is the air pump that I would use. So, just be aware of that. And I think that the AP100, I think that means that you can have up to 100 outlets on that particular unit. But I don't know for a fact. So, don't quote me on that. Definitely check into it. But if you're setting up a room that has 20, 30 tanks, you may not need a pump the same size as the one that I have. We used to have 120 tanks hooked up to just that one Pond Master AP100. Maybe I'll stick a link to that, on my website. So if you're looking for one of these, you can go on there and order it direct from our website. So, it's a very efficient pump, but when I bought it, I bought 2. Now let me tell you a little story. When we were at the house, I told you about the blower that I have. Well, that blower was bought in an emergency situation. The scenario that I just laid out for you happened to me. But here's the thing. When I bought my linear piston air pump, I bought 2 of them, just like I said. I took my own advice and I bought 2 of them. But one of them went out, and this was after, a year of hard use, folks. I mean, these things, they do go out. It happens. It's not like it broke 3 days after I bought it. A year of hard use, this thing went out. So I hooked up the other one, and I ordered I'm sorry. I'm telling you wrong. I hooked up the backup, and I said, okay, my backup is running now. Everybody's okay. Everything's fine, but I'm definitely going to want to get that other one rebuilt. And I just never got around to ordering the rebuild kit for that Pond Master. And what happened? The second one went out. And when that second one went out, that was panic mode. It was my fault. I should have rebuilt. And these linear piston air pumps, you can order a kit. If they go out, you can order this kit. It's like $20, and you have to be a little bit handy to do it, but you can rebuild the manifold, or not manifold, what's it called? Diaphragm that's inside the filter, and you can get them working again. I just never ordered that. And so it is a Saturday. My pump just went out, my second one, and I don't have a backup. What am I going to do? I called my buddy, down in Richmond, Virginia. His name's Mark Sneed, and he used to have a shop down there called Cichlid Solutions. And, this is actually, that shop is where I used to attend aquarium club meetings for the Central Virginia Aquarium Society, which is where I met the guy Flippercon84 from YouTube, and he is the guy who suggested that I start a YouTube channel. Just a little backstory there. I called up Mark. He had just closed his shop, and I said, Mark, I'm in a pinch here. I need a pump. Do you have any backup pumps? And it just so happened that he had his blower that he was using in his shop, and nobody had bought it yet. He was selling everything off from his shop. And so I ran down to Richmond and I bought that pump off of him and I brought it back and saved the day. But don't put yourself in that position. Have a backup air pump just in case things go bad. The linear piston air pumps are very easy to fix if they go wrong, but you don't want to be in the position that I was in, and not have any kind of backup at all. So we've talked about heat. We've talked about water supply. We've talked about the racks, the design of your racks, whether you're going to put your tanks front face or sideways. We've talked about filtration. We've talked about heating the tanks themselves. And we've talked about air. Now, the last couple of things to talk about are just things to touch on briefly that we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on it. And that would be lids for your tanks and lighting. Now, I know lids might sound like something that's pretty common sense, but here's the thing. Most people, when they are putting together fish rooms, they don't think about lids, or the lids are something that they think, well, I'll just get to those later. I made that mistake when I set up my shop, and look at them now. 90% of the tanks in my shop have no lids on them at all. This is why when you walk into my shop, it is like walking into a sauna. Not only do we heat the entire room to 80 degrees, but it's also one of the most humid places you will ever go. And so it's very hot, very humid, and the humidity would be there no matter what. But if I had the tanks covered, it wouldn't be quite as bad. It would be a little bit more manageable, and it wouldn't feel as hot in the room as it does. Most of the reason why it feels so hot is because of the humidity. So don't let lids be an afterthought. There's a couple of different things that you can do for lids. There's some DIY lids. Joey has done a video recently about a DIY aquarium lid. Cichlid Man 09 Forrest did the same type of lid. He did kind of a collaboration with Joey where he did the exact same type of lid using the same type of material. It's panels that can be used in greenhouses. I've never seen this stuff for sale, but I know it's out there. A very cheap way of doing lids for all of your tanks. Put some time and thought into your lids, folks, and put it as something on the budget, because it's one of those things that if you say, I'll get to it later, 2 years down the road, you still won't have lids on your tanks, just like me. So they are expensive, and this is one of the reasons why they get put on the back burner, and you're like, I'll just deal with those later. And then it becomes, well, they're so expensive, I don't have the money to do it later. You want to put some thought into this. If you're going to buy the glass canopies that you can buy that are pre-made for your aquarium, those are outrageously expensive. But if you can want to make your own, you can use Joey's design of those little greenhouse panels. You can use glass and cut it yourself. But I would not call a glass shop and say, can you make lids for my 40, 75 gallon tanks? It's going to cost you an arm and a leg. So, if you have the money, do it however you're going to do it. Just get your tanks covered. Understand that the tanks do need to be something that's clear. I know that sounds funny, but I'm not going to give names. I won't do it. But I promise you, I went to a shop that used green board. Now, green board is something that we should have talked about a little bit ago, but if you're familiar with construction at all, when they put walls up into bathrooms, they use a product that's called green board. It's drywall that is green, and it's basically made with an additive in it that helps to prevent mold and mildew. That's all it is. And so people use that in rooms that have a lot of moisture in the room. If you're going to be building a fish room from scratch and you're actually framing it in and you're going to put walls up and everything, I would suggest using this green board. But anyway, this green board looks exactly like drywall. And it's made out of rock. It's sheetrock. And it's got a green backing on it. Light does not penetrate this, folks. And I've been to a shop that used this green board as lids for their tanks. which meant all of their tanks were like little black holes. You couldn't see anything in them. It was really bad. So you definitely want your lids to be clear. I know that sounds like common sense, but I mean, use something like glass or acrylic or plexiglass or these panels that Joey and Forrest have on their videos. What I did in my garage, and I don't think that this was the most efficient way of doing it, but what I did was I went to Lowe's because Home Depot doesn't sell the glass, or at least mine doesn't. And I bought 3/16 inch glass panels. They sell them for replacing panes on your windows and stuff like that. I did not have Lowe's cut them. No, I'm a handy guy. I'm an idiot. I decided to cut them all myself, and I did fine. I mean, I bought all of this glass and I brought it home and I put together a nice little workbench to work with, and I laid down a blanket and I cut all of these glass lids myself, and it worked. I used, what are those daggone things called that you buy and you stick them on your wall, and it's like a little coat hook, and you use, it comes with a little backing. You peel the paper off and stick it on there, and it's like a little coat hook that you can hang on your walls. And then it has a little tab on it that I'm sitting here demonstrating like you can see me. It has a little tab on it that you pull, and it releases the backing, and you can pull it off the wall without damaging it. I don't know what that thing is called, but I bought a whole bunch of those to serve as the handles on my glass lids, and I made all of my lids myself. It was a disaster. The 3/16 inch glass breaks very easily, and then you have glass in your tank, and it was a dumb thing to do, but you know, I'm the smartest man in the world, and I made that decision, and that's why I did it. And just more reason to prove why I am not the smartest man in the world. But I would suggest, if you're going to be putting lids on all of these tanks, I would either use the greenhouse panels like you see in Joey and Forrest's video, or buy the ones that are pre-made, or use something like acrylic. It's not easy to cut. I don't care what Joey says. It's not easy to cut, but it's a very good way to put lids on your tank. Much more expensive, but lids should be pretty much common sense. And the last thing is lighting. Now, lighting is where you can absolutely go broke. And the thing is, us as fish keepers, we are very rarely satisfied with the lighting of our tanks. And when you have a fish room, that's not going to change. But there's really two things to look at here. Again, are you setting this up as a showroom, or are you setting it up as a business? If you're going to set it up as a business, I would recommend that you just use the little standard shop lights. You can see them in my videos. They're very cheap. They're like $10 a piece for a 4-foot light fixture. They're very bright. You can get all different kinds of T12 bulbs. You can even get the ones that have the tint to them that, you know, are made for like aquarium plants and stuff like that, make the water look purple. I mean, there's all different kinds of bulbs that you can get. They're very expensive, the bulbs. But for me, I just use, if all I'm trying to do is light the tank for shop purposes, I use the 4-foot shop fixtures with daylight bulbs on them. And it works really, really well. They don't like moisture, so you do need to have a few backups sitting around. But they work really well. They're very cheap. And if you're setting this up as a business, that's what I would use. But if you're setting this up as a showpiece, if you have the money, I mean, buy LEDs or buy T5s for all of these. But if you're looking for DIY ways of making LED light strips and stuff like that, there's a lot of different videos out there. Again, Joey has a video about doing your own LED systems. I swear this podcast is starting to become an advertisement for the King of DIY's channel on YouTube. But hey, I mean, he's covered it all, so might as well bring that up and tell you that he has a video out there about it. I don't have a video about it, so I can't refer you to me. Joey has a video out there on making your own LED light strips. And one of the ways that he does it is by using gutters for your home. You know, they go along your roof, that collect the rain and run it down your downspout. There's a lot, and I've seen a lot of people do this. They use gutters, they put the caps on it, and they put LED strips up in the gutter. When you turn it upside down and you put it on top of your tank, it looks exactly like an aquarium light. It's a very cheap way of doing this. There's a lot of ways of lighting it, but again, if you're going to do this as a business, I would use just the shop lighting and keep a couple extras just in case. The bulbs are cheap, the fixtures are cheap, and if one goes out, it's $10. You replace it and you're good to go. So I hope that this hasn't completely overwhelmed you. An hour and 20 minutes worth of me running my mouth about setting up a fish room. I hope I haven't completely overwhelmed you about it. This has been a lot of fun. It's something that I could have probably done 3 times as much content on because there's so much involved in setting up a fish room. But just remember those key things when you sit down in your room and you're going to make your decisions about how you're going to set up your fish room. The first thing you need to ask is, what's it going to be for? Is this going to be a showroom or is it going to be for a business? You need to consider heat, humidity, water supply, and electricity. These are the big things that you need to consider before you even move one tank into that room. And remember, design it to accommodate more tanks than you plan on putting in there, because you know you will add more. So I want to thank you all so much for listening to this. I didn't talk at all about building the racks, because there's really no way to talk about building racks on a podcast. But if you are curious to know how I build mine, I did just put a video up 2 days ago showing how I build aquarium stands. I'm sitting here as we speak looking at the stand that I built in that video. It's a very efficient, very easy DIY stand that you can build with minimal tools and minimal lumber, and it is very, very strong. So definitely check that out if you haven't seen it already. Thank you so much for listening to this. Remember, please do me the favor, show me the love, and maybe do a review for us, or go over to iTunes and give us a rating or a review or something like that. Help us continue to climb that ladder of podcasts on iTunes, because, hey, if we're going to make it as a podcast, it's going to have to be through iTunes. So we need to continue to build our brand on iTunes and on Stitchers, and you can help with that. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week.